stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now.
Thanks, Jerry, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1408th edition of Motorsports Unlimited. First, let me offer my apologies for the length of time it has taken to follow up on what I started regarding the future of motorsport that began in the episode of Motorsports Unlimited titled Explanation 4. If you'll recall, I had serious back surgery involving the removal of 4 discs in my lower back, coupled with the installation of 2 titanium rods screwed to both sides of my spine. I had no idea I'd be laid up for an extended period of time. I mean, I've had back surgery before, and while they were serious, they were nothing like this. Usually, as I recall, it was a couple of days in the hospital, then a week or so at home, and I was off and running again. This time, 2 neurosurgeons operated on me for 9 hours. Then I was hospitalized for 3 weeks, then bedridden at home for months. In short, it was outside of what I'd ever experienced before by a wide margin. Of course, I was very concerned about Motorsports Unlimited. Part of our ability to attract an audience is based in part on never asking folks to watch a rerun. In fact, we once went 14 years without a rerun. That's a new 1-hour show every week, week after week for 14 years. Oh, I'm not talking about Talking Heads show where people sit down in the studio and talk while the tape is rolling. I'm talking about every show including both location and studio work. Winter, summer, spring, and fall, blizzards, rainstorms, 100-degree heat. For 14 years, we produced a new show every week. We were well aware we weren't ABC, NBC, or CBS, and they could do everything better than we could. So why should people watch our little Access show when they all have an option of turning to one of the networks? One has to remember, we don't compete with other Access shows. They aren't on at the same time. We compete with the networks. Part of our strategy to compete was to put new material on the air every week. It was a ton of work, but it was effective, and people became accustomed to it. Now, after this latest surgery, I found myself flat on my back, unable to even get out of bed, let alone produce programming. It was a devastating reality after 30 years of effort. I felt Motorsports Unlimited slipping through my fingers. When I was finally able to move around a little bit and get to the computer, then to my car, I decided to drag my butt to the studio and tape something about what had happened to me so our audience understood why they were not seeing new episodes of Motorsports Unlimited. Fortunately, the guys at Comcast in Elmhurst went out of their way to help me. Frankly, the first time I was able to drag myself to the studio, months after the surgery, I was so exhausted after I got there, without their help, I probably wouldn't have gotten anything on tape. I am forever grateful. These are good guys. As soon as I was able, I contacted all of the cable operators airing Motorsports Unlimited and asked them to please be patient. I was going to do my best that I could produce new programming, including medical updates. I explained this meant airing the same show for lengthy periods because it was so physically difficult for me to produce new ones, but as I was able, I'd be sending them new ones, explaining what had happened and what was happening. As far as I know, and based on email feedback, that's what has been happening, and I'm thankful for their indulgence. In addition, my old friend John Platania frequently made the long trip in from the far west suburbs to help me record the medical updates in the studio. The first was Explanation 1, in which I basically explained why they were seeing old material and the progress of my physical condition. Explanation 2 continued with this theme of mixing old Motorsports Unlimited footage with a medical update. Explanation 3 continued the same, but by this time I was starting to realize this was going to be a much longer pull than I ever anticipated. A couple of things occurred to me. First, as slowly as I was recovering, this could well be the end of Motorsports Unlimited. Second, there was so much left that I hadn't even begun to cover. Of course, I'm talking about Steam. Oh, and the brand new motorsport of drones. But I suppose that would always be the case regardless of when Motorsports Unlimited concluded. There will always be something new on the horizon we haven't brought to your attention. No, there was something much more important we had to get to. Something so important I felt I had to get it off my chest while I still could. I guess I was becoming aware of my own mortality. Over the years, I've had many serious injuries and medical problems. Everything from a severely broken right leg at a motorcycle race in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin that left me with a compound fracture of both the tibia and fibula that had me laid up for a year and a half, to open heart surgery in the form of a quadruple bypass, to back surgery to deal with a sciatic nerve problem that was crippling me, to neck surgery to replace 3 discs in my deck and deal with a stenosis problem. Oh yes, there was the installation of a pacemaker. Of course there was more, but the point is, in every case, regardless of how serious, I recovered and kept on trucking, so to speak. This seems to be different. I don't seem to be getting better. I asked if the problem is the seriousness of the surgery or my age. The response was both. At 72 years old, one doesn't just bounce right back from something like this. I'm beginning to wonder if I'll ever recover. My boat hasn't moved in 5 years. My snowmobile hasn't moved in 7 years. I haven't ridden a motorcycle in a year and a half. I guess everything comes to an end. But I sure hope that's not the case with Motorsports Unlimited. But if it is, I have to get some things off my chest, if for no other reason than perhaps, with the groundwork done, someone else will pick up the ball. In explanation for I started with a medical update. It was particularly important because I'd suffered a fall that I feared did some damage, and part of what I was doing was trying to figure out something I could pass on to others so they wouldn't have to go through what I've gone through, so I had to mention what I learned from the fall. Then, instead of filling the show up with old footage, I decided it was time to explain the purpose of Motorsports Unlimited and what we were trying to accomplish during the past 30 years. I explained my frame of reference. Being old enough to remember before there was television and the effect this medium has had on our society, I explained why I felt that if we didn't solve the television problem, motorsport was doomed. Most compelling was a survey I took at the then just opened Woodfield Mall. It revealed that television was responsible for our inability to effectively compete in the sports entertainment marketplace, and that information, coupled with my lifelong experience in all phases of motorsport, from actually racing cars and motorcycles to being a boater and taking flying lessons to organizing racing events to holding racing seminars, from building engines to fabricating chassis, you name it. If it's a part of motorsport, I've done it. I've drag raced, oval track raced, road raced, motocrossed, I've raced on dirt, I've raced on pavement, I've raced on ice. I've looked at this thing we call motorsport from every conceivable angle, trying to understand why such an exciting, dramatic, technically interesting human drama activity that actually contributes to our national economic health and culture is failing so miserably in the sports entertainment marketplace. What are we missing? There is no question in my mind that our omission from television was responsible, and I spent a little time explaining why I felt that way, and that's where we left it last time. Of course, that was 30 years ago. The realization that television had screwed us was 30 years ago. The question was, what, if anything, could be done about it? Even though I expected the results, the survey was game-changing. Thinking about what we should do with our sport to make it more competitive pursuing audience was a waste of time and energy, as I became fond of saying. We could gold-plate our activities and it wouldn't make any difference because no one would know about it. Television was all-powerful, and our omission from television had doomed us to eventual elimination, something I could not nor ever would accept. So now what? It seemed to me I had to find out why some folks got to use the airwaves and some didn't, and who decides? I began investigating the history of the broadcast industry. That's right, the broadcast industry. It's not just television. Most of the laws and regulations began with radio. It all started with the conclusion of World War I. I said World War I. That's about 1918. Now, you might wonder why you should care about World War I in 1918. It's because that's where the problems that prevent the motorsport community from survival originated. Oh, by the way, it sure isn't just the motorsport community that has been brought to its knees, and I'll get into that a little bit as we move on, but I can only speak with authority about what I know, of what I've been intimately involved with my entire life. I may open a few other eyes along the way, and that will be for them to consider action as they come to understand my point. But my focus is the survival of motorsport. Okay, the end of World War I in 1918. It seems that usable radio technology developed during World War I. When World War I ended and American soldiers returned home at the conclusion, the technically inclined had developed an interest in this new technology. It didn't take long, and everyone capable of putting together a crystal set, as they were called, was doing so. Followed shortly by primitive transmitters. In short, like all new technology, the laws of physics apply equally to everyone, and those who liked it were doing it. My reading of this period reminded me somewhat of the CB craze in the latter part of the 1900s, accompanied by the same problems. With everybody on the air, no one could be heard. This was a real problem for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is we live in a country that constitutionally guarantees every one of us free speech and free press. So now what? We have thousands of people broadcasting radio, and, as happened with the CB radio 50 years later, with everyone on the air, no one could be heard. This was not a small problem. Broadcast is technically limiting. There is only so much channel capacity, and with thousands of people broadcasting, everyone steps on everyone else. A better way of saying it is what I said before. With everyone on the air, no one could be heard. Now what? It was a growing argument in the early 20s of the last century. It turns out radio wasn't just a passing novelty, and more people wanted to broadcast. In addition, after World War I, Europe and the rest of the world were already developing sophisticated broadcast systems because they weren't limited by a constitution that guaranteed all of its citizens the right of free speech and free press. In short, the argument boiled down to, how could a country that guarantees all of its citizens free speech and free press prevent people from participating in the most powerful, most persuasive, most pervasive communications medium ever created? Yet, if America was ever to benefit from this wonderful new technology called radio, participation was going to have to be drastically limited. What would you have done? At the time, the population of the United States was about 100 million, and while everyone didn't want to broadcast, millions did. There were only a few channels available, so now what? Reading newspaper accounts of the time were interesting. The argument came down to those who believed everyone has an equal right to broadcast and shouldn't be prevented from doing so in a country that guarantees free speech and free press for everyone. And those who pointed out America would never be able to benefit from radio if participation wasn't limited. It really was a tough question, and both sides had good arguments. Those who were screaming for Congress to get involved were well aware that the rest of the world was surging ahead with radio technology. And those who were conscious of the potentially enormous power radio could have were sounding the caution when limiting constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. It was a heck of a problem, and something America hadn't faced before. What to do? Leave radio unregulated and the likelihood America would never have the ability to communicate to all of its citizens at one time? Or limit participation and begin a nationwide broadcast system and, at the same time, denying the ability to participate to the vast majority of Americans? Now, while you give this some thought, I'll bet I can scratch up some classic Motorsports Unlimited footage so you'll remember you are watching Motorsports Unlimited, and I'll be right back with more of this important discussion.
What a way to go!
It's time to check out some first-round Chicago Wise Guy action.
Off to the left side, white lane goes 788, 1-7.
Pete Demos tries to pair up the cars with similar performance potential, but we all find ourselves waiting for the next Wise Guy to get into the sixes with that magic 200 miles per hour. While Joe Brackey had mechanical trouble tonight, as this show was being edited, we learned he turned a 697 at 203 miles an hour a month later. If my math is correct, that makes 6 wise guys in the exclusive 200 mile per hour 6-second club.
Your number one qualifier right away. Burnout box area. Here comes
As Chuck and I watched, one thing became obvious. Regardless of what anyone else does, everybody waits to see Mike Ricci lay down the pass everyone will be shooting at for the event.
Of the one
Check it out yourself next time you see the Chicago Wise Guys run. It's pretty dramatic.
We've got some giveaways, some new bullets that we'll give away. Ladies and gentlemen, your number one qualifier by 7/1000ths of a second.
Following startup and an extensive pre-flight, he was ready to taxi out.
We were all very excited. This was the aircraft's maiden flight following restoration, and Mike Keena made it a good one.
Okay, I'm back, and as usual, I don't know what you just saw because I write and record these pieces long before I select the Motorsports Unlimited classic footage I eventually insert. No matter, I'm sure it was great stuff and designed to remind you you are watching Motorsports Unlimited, not a talk show. And now it's time to continue the discussion regarding my 30-year-old efforts to ensure the survival of motorsport. As you have probably concluded by now, I was absolutely satisfied that our omission from television was responsible for our inability to effectively compete in the sports entertainment marketplace, especially when one considers our competitors for public attention in that marketplace were prominently included, and an investigation of the origin of the broadcast industry, the description of that investigation alluded to in the previous episode of Motorsports Unlimited, partially revealed the problem. I say partially because while the newspaper accounts of the time were important to understand the mood of the public, at least equally important was the mood of Congress. In order to have a peek at that all-important attitude, after all, they make the laws, I investigated the congressional record from 1924, 1925, and 1926 as it is related to this issue. Interesting enough, Congress was as divided as the general public. Same problem. With an extremely limited channel capacity and thousands, perhaps millions, wanting to broadcast, there didn't seem to be an equitable way to distribute the airtime. I must admit, I was very impressed with the in-depth thought Congress gave to the issue. Even though we were just talking about radio, television was decades away in the early 20s of the last century, they were well aware of the potential power they were contemplating giving away. I suppose it could be argued they really weren't aware of the kind of power broadcast represented because mankind had never experienced anything quite like it before. I mean, the ability to talk to and influence an entire nation? Probably a little difficult to imagine in 1926. Still, the discussion indicated that they knew it would be important, and there was no quick resolution. The argument was often heated and went on for several years. Basically, it boiled down to recognizing the airwaves were public property, and in a perfect world, everyone should have equal access. However, technical limitations excluded this possibility. The obvious answer is to drastically limit, the number of people allowed to broadcast. Except, who decides who gets to broadcast and for what purpose? In a country that constitutionally guarantees every one of its citizens free speech and free press, it would seem to be an unsolvable problem. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, particularly Europe, was developing sophisticated radio broadcast systems. The argument in this country raged on. Finally, by 1927, it was clear to everyone, regardless of which side of the argument you were on, if we didn't develop some sort of permission system in America, America would never be able to benefit from this wonderful new technology called radio. In 1927, Congress moved and passed the Radio Act of 1927, which essentially said, we are going to allow a small number of people to broadcast and prevent everyone else, by law, from broadcasting. Essentially, that meant Congress was going to anoint a privileged few with broadcast privileges while denying the rest of the population any opportunity to broadcast, and they were going to use their, meaning the general population's, money to enforce it. There was a caveat, however. Those who received the privilege of broadcasting must, by law, serve the public interest. This has been interpreted many ways over the years. My reading of the period suggests this wording was intended to force broadcasters to share the airwaves with those who were not granted the privilege of broadcasting. I'm sure others would interpret public interest to mean whatever served their interests. I'll let them speak for themselves. I find it inconceivable that anyone would think Congress meant to say, we're giving this enormous power to influence the entire country to a wealthy, privileged few, and everyone else's right of free speech and free press is over. Yet, that is exactly what happened. Now let me take a moment to restate, we are talking about radio. Just radio. As powerful as radio would prove to be, it is nothing compared to television. Yet, television is regulated by exactly the same laws and enforcement apparatus as radio. It's all broadcast. In hindsight, I'm sure everyone would agree this was a horrible mistake. But of course, hindsight is always 20/20. I think the early legislators dealing with this problem can be forgiven for their lack of foresight. I'm sure in 1927 it was pretty hard to imagine what being able to whisper in the ear of the entire country would be capable of doing, and the idea of being able to dazzle the public with as yet not invented technology that would enable some entities to put images as well as words in front of an entire nation was beyond even the most imaginative legislator's ability to consider the possibilities. Personally, I find the idea that in a free society with a written guarantee of free speech and free press for all of its citizens, that we would even ponder the idea that some wouldn't get it unconstitutional. Let's understand that free speech and free press is a comparative commodity. Let's face it, the ability to sit in a locked closet and say anything you want isn't much of a freedom, particularly if others are allowed to stand on a soapbox in a public square and have their say. I mean, you both get to say what you want, but the poor guy in the closet wouldn't be heard, negating the very point of free speech and free press. The offering of opinion only has value if one is heard. Obviously, Congress was dealing with a very tough problem, and with the Radio Act of 1927, they were saying they were granting permission to some to broadcast, and at the same time were telling the remaining population they can't, by law. Not what any of our forefathers would have recognized as freedom. The lawmakers were very conscious of the danger of what they were doing. Even in 1927, it was clear that the power broadcasters had to persuade or dominate the public consciousness was awesome. From regulation's inception, they were careful to make sure that the broadcasters and public alike understood that the airwaves are a public resource and do not belong to the broadcasters, and government regulation does not grant one person more right to use the public airwaves than anyone else. In 1934, Congress passed the Communications Act that created the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. Essentially, this reaffirmed the Radio Act of 1927 and created a regulatory agency to carry out the will of Congress. I'd like to take a moment here to comment on the power of broadcast and the difference between radio and television. I think it should be noted that by 1934, when Congress created the FCC, no less than the President of the United States was beginning to recognize the power of broadcast. Remember, this was long before television. Franklin D. Roosevelt, better known to the kids today as FDR, began his now famous fireside chats in 1933. These fireside chats were basically live radio broadcasts created to calm a public on the verge of panicking over his initiatives to save the banks and end the Depression. If I may quote Wikipedia, Roosevelt understood that his administration's success depended upon a favorable dialogue with the electorate, possible only through methods of mass communication, and that the true power of the presidency was the ability to take the initiative. The use of radio for direct appeals was perhaps the most important of FDR's innovations in political communication. Roosevelt's opponents had control of most newspapers in the 1930s, and press reports were under their control and involved their editorial commentary. Historian Betty Winfield says he and his advisors worried that newspaper bias would affect the news columns, and rightly so. Historian Douglas Crane says that FDR offered voters a chance to receive information unadulterated by newspaper proprietors' bias through the new medium of radio. FDR's press secretary, commenting on the value of radio, said, "It cannot misrepresent or misquote. It is far-reaching and simultaneous in releasing messages given it for transmission to the nation or for international consumption." I must say, researching the early broadcast industry is interesting from a number of perspectives. It quickly became clear they didn't know exactly what they had, but they sensed it had power. Once again, let me say, while it's easy to look back and wonder why these folks failed to protect public interest, it must be remembered this was brand new to mankind. Let me repeat that. Brand new to mankind. Who could have guessed the kind of power broadcast would eventually wield? FDR liked speaking directly to the public, so newspaper interests couldn't control or distort his message. But unfortunately, he or they failed to see those same interests that opposed him could eventually control broadcast. Even with the provision that the broadcasters must serve the public interest, something newspapers didn't have to deal with, what with the freedom of the press and all, and the admonition that those who got to broadcast had no more right to the airwaves than those who were prevented from broadcasting, how soon we forget, allow me to underline that thought. I just said newspapers didn't have to deal with the notion of serving the public interest because they enjoyed the umbrella of freedom of the press. Doesn't that apply to broadcast too, you might wonder? Absolutely not, I would respond. There is a huge difference between newspapers and broadcast. It doesn't matter how well television or radio dresses up their presentations to look like journalism. It isn't. One can only be a journalist if he or she presents their material on a forum available to all. Otherwise, it's just pitching, as in pitching a product or pitching an idea. Anyone can start a newspaper, thus there are competing opinions and views. No one is prevented by law from printing a newspaper. But no one can start broadcasting. It is only available to a privileged few by law. Yes, there is some, as yet almost 100 years later, undefined legal obligation to serve the public interest and some vague pseudo-promise that those licensed to broadcast have no more right to broadcast than those who are not licensed. In reality, people are arrested all the time broadcasting once they are caught. I see no delivery on the obligation to serve the public interest or the promise that we all have a right to use the airwaves. From my point of view, it just isn't true. In my view, the public airwaves have been turned over to the wealthy and privileged, and the rest of us are out. And what comes with that, you might ask? Consider the current campaign to run for president. Oh, I guess I should say, for those seeing this years from now, the campaign to which I refer is the Clinton versus Sanders versus Trump campaigns to be nominees of their political party. It doesn't really make any difference which campaign I use as an example. In television-dominated America, all political campaigns have come to understand one cannot be elected to significant public office without television time. Certainly you'll find that's right in line with the point I'm trying to make. But what is odd is the complaining most do about the incredibly high cost of running for office. The vast majority of the money is spent on television advertising. Odd. Because these are not stupid people. Greedy, selfish, perhaps, but certainly not stupid. One would think they would recognize they either are or are going to be part of the government, and they could easily pass legislation that essentially confiscates a portion of the airtime available for political purposes. A case could be easily made that this would inform the public about those running for office and would serve the public interest without costing the candidates. If that's true, then one has to ask themselves, why don't they do it? Why spend hundreds of millions of dollars unnecessarily? The answer is simple. The high cost of running for significant public office keeps out the riffraff. It ensures that only the wealthy and privileged have a real opportunity to compete for public office, or at least only those who either are or have the support of the wealthy and privileged. I mentioned earlier that one trivializes television at their own peril. You see, while radio gave folks the opportunity to whisper in the ear of the entire population, television is in your face. Yes, it whispers in your ear as radio did, but in addition, it tempts you with images. It has been said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and television illustrates that perfectly. Yes, it whispers in your ear, but it also screams at your eyes. It controls both words and pictures, and it has power beyond what anyone could have dreamed of in 1950. Believe me, I know, I was there. Today it is omnipresent and literally controls everything we think. You don't think so? Let me ask you, what war are you thinking about right now? This is 2016, so in all likelihood your response would be the Middle East. It really doesn't make any difference what year it happens to be. The war you're thinking about and the people with whom you are angry is the one being reported on television. Right now, it's ISIS and the Middle East. But the fact is, right now, there are more than a dozen wars going on around the world. The one you think about is the one being reported on television. You can pick your time in recent history and look closely, and you'll find there are or were anywhere from a dozen to 40 wars going on around the world. I assure you, the only one you'll think about or even know about is the one being reported on television. This is awesome, indeed awesome, unparalleled power. Never before in history has that power been available. I suppose that's what makes it so difficult to deal with. We have no experience with this sort of power. Of course, it's interesting to refer to the current political climate for examples, but that would miss my point. Like any other citizen, I have an interest in politics, but it's not my area of expertise. My interest is motorsport, and it's also my area of expertise. Motorsport is one of the competitors in the sports entertainment marketplace, and as such, its survival is dependent on audience. That's what pays the bills. It really doesn't make any difference if we're talking about ticket sales or selling television rights. It's all based on audience. Our ability to compete for audience is directly connected to our presence on television. Oh, I'm not talking about races on television. I'm talking about television news. Back in the 50s, again, I was there, television news used to be on at noon and 6 p.m. and just before bed at 10 p.m. Today it's on in the morning, all morning, at noon, in the afternoon, again at 6 p.m., and several times in the evening. From the time you wake up until you go to bed, there is nonstop news. And with that, sports news. Oh, not all sports, specific sports. Which ones? We'll get to that. Right now I'm focusing on the power of television, and I have an excellent personal example to offer. Now, I want to say in advance, I certainly don't want to offend anyone, and I have good friends who I respect that are fans. But I need to make my point about the power of television, and this is a good one. So here goes. One of the sports I don't care anything about is hockey. I can't imagine watching a game on TV in which you can't see the object of the game. I mean, come on. You can't see the puck. Whether that's the reason I don't have any interest in hockey or not isn't really the point. Whatever the reason, I have no interest in it. With that as background, you can imagine my surprise when Wayne Gretzky was setting records scoring goals and I ended up following it. No, I didn't watch any games, but when the news came on, I made sure I caught the sports portion to see if he scored any more goals. I mean, how could you not take an interest when every day, regardless of the time of day, regardless of the channel, the public was kept updated many times a day on where Wayne Gretzky was in the latest goal count? That's the power of television in which I'm interested. Its power to dominate the public consciousness. There are many examples of television's power to influence in the political world, or for that matter, in the commercial world. It would be virtually impossible to launch a new product into the national marketplace without a television campaign. That is nearly unthinkable power. But it's not my world. I remember thinking about it when Wayne Gretzky was scoring all those goals. I can't believe I was interested, but I was. I have no interest in hockey, yet every day I looked forward to seeing if he'd scored more goals. I guess the human drama of it was appealing. It was an example of what I wanted for motorsport. I think it's time for me to take a moment to explain an incident that helped form my views regarding television and its power to influence. Before I do, I want to say I could have picked similar stories from any kind of racing, any other track or any kind of racing. What I'm going to describe happened to take place at Santa Fe Speedway and involved late model dirt car racing. But it could have just as easily been Raceway Park in Blue Island, Illinois. You know, it's actually Calumet Park. It's a long story, and I'll explain it one of these days, but not now. Suffice to say, I'm talking about the Raceway Park on Ashland Avenue and 130th Street, just south of Chicago, and like all other tracks, was loaded with talented stars and great characters. Or it could have been O'Hare Stadium, like Geneva Raceway, Waukegan Speedway, or any of the local racetracks. All have big stars and fierce competition and the inevitable rivalries. But the story I'm about to share took place at Santa Fe Speedway. Now, I've already explained that I raced motorcycles at Santa Fe Speedway for 5 years, from 1970 through 1975. The regular weekly motorcycle events took place on Wednesday nights, but they did occasionally have special events like a national championship on Friday nights. Anyway, the point is, the stock car races were held on Friday and Saturday nights and sometimes Sunday afternoons. Thus, the guys who raced motorcycles never saw the stock car races or knew anything about stock cars. It wasn't lack of interest, we were busy. The serious professional flat track motorcycle racers raced Granite City near St. Louis on Tuesday nights, Santa Fe Speedway on Wednesday nights, often Danville, Illinois on Thursday nights, and then, of course, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were reserved for the big half miles all over the Midwest. There just wasn't any time to check out what the other guys were doing. Of course, we would occasionally talk about the stock car guys, usually to argue about whether we ran quicker laps than them or something interesting going on, but we were essentially separate groups. It would be easy to race motorcycles at Santa Fe Speedway for a decade and never see a stock car. And it would be equally possible to race stock cars at Santa Fe Speedway for a decade and never see a motorcycle. Still, I was curious. Whenever anyone mentioned a stock car or stock car racer at Santa Fe Speedway, they inevitably mentioned Tony Izzo. It seems he was a many-time track champion and usually the standard by which others were judged. One summer night when I was recovering from injuries and unable to race, I decided to take in a stock car race. I sort of wanted to see how they compared to the motorcycles. It was a little hard to imagine. Santa Fe is a small track and cars are big. Even on motorcycles, it was difficult to pass. It was hard to imagine how cars could actually find room to pass each other. Anyway, I wanted to see it. And since I was recovering from injuries and couldn't race anyway, it was a perfect opportunity. I went to the Speedway on a beautiful Saturday night and looked around trying to figure out where the best place to watch a stock car race might be. I had favorite places from which to watch the bikes, but cars are different, and I wanted the best possible vantage point from which to watch. I finally decided I'd move around a bit during practice and the heat race and find the best spot to occupy during the feature. In the meantime, I started talking to a few of the spectators. I wanted to know which car was Izzo's so I could keep track of him. I was surprised to learn his car was pink. From everything I'd heard, Tony was supposed to be something of a tough guy. I didn't expect a pink car. Pink, number 66. As I was inquiring, I quickly found out there were people there who hated him and people who loved him. There didn't seem to be an in-between. His fans loved him and thought he was the best ever, but there were as many or more fans of competing drivers. Apparently, the Tony Izzo and Jimmy O'Connor wars on the racetrack were the stuff of which legends were made. It wasn't just Jimmy O'Connor either. Little John Provenzano had fans who insisted he was the equal of Izzo, and Al Johnson fans were convinced he was better. There was more, but you get the idea. I even talked to older fans who flat stated Tony Izzo wouldn't have a chance against Dick Nelson or Van Allen or Ken Finley. These were all stars from an earlier era. One thing was sure. Love him or hate him, they all knew who Tony Izzo was. As the cars started rolling out on the track for practice, my eyes searched the field for a pink number 66. My first impression was how powerful these cars were. The talk in the stands indicated 800 horsepower, 2,400 pounds. I believed it. They got sideways as soon as the driver touched the throttle. The rear tires were huge. There didn't seem to be a limit. They looked like they were 15 or 16 inches wide. And still they couldn't really get a hold of the racetrack. The passing I was thinking about really looked impossible considering how quickly the cars got sideways when the driver hit the gas. The cars were plenty wide when they were going straight, but sideways they almost blocked the track. Just then, I saw the pink number 66. I watched him closely. He was fast, there was no question about that, but so was everybody else. In a few words, these cars were violent and appeared uncontrollable. After a few laps, the pink 66 disappeared into the pits. I watched the other cars. Almost without noticing, the pink 66 was back on the track again. He apparently made some changes that helped. He was really hauling ass. But they all were. Just then, under full power on the front straightaway, something happened, and the pink number 66 was somewhere in the middle of it. I could only see a cloud of dust. Then, out of the plume, I saw an entire rear end assembly complete with tires, wheels, banjo housing, everything shot high in the air. At least the height of the catch bench, which must have been 30 feet high. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Rear end assemblies don't just come out of cars because someone left a bolt loose. It would take a violent hit to tear it out from under the car. I'd never really seen anything like this before, and based on the crowd reaction, they hadn't either. As the dust cleared, I could see it was the pink number 66's car's rear end. The pink number 66 was sitting in the middle of the front straightaway, butt on the ground with no rear wheels. It was indeed Tony Izzo, the driver I came to see. As I watched them load the car with a winch onto a flatbed truck, I could see there was no chance to fix the car. This was major damage and not something one could repair in the pits. I wished now that I'd popped for a pit pass. I really wanted to know what happened. Rear end assemblies don't just pop out. They are connected to lots of stuff. In fact, what I'd seen didn't seem possible. But I saw it. I watched the races with a little less enthusiasm after I watched the pink number 66 car tied down on a flatbed truck being taken out of the pits. I could just see the top half of the car because the bank track obscured my view of the pits, but there was no doubt the pink number 66 left the track. Now, I didn't really know who to watch. I didn't follow this kind of racing, but I had to admit the races were as good as the motorcycle races. Well, almost as good. Of course, racing, like any other sport, is much more compelling if you know the rules, a little about the history, and most important, a knowledge of the human drama. While I was in the stands, I learned Tony Izzo had won more track championships than any other driver in the history of the track. But there were other track champions out there, and I tried to pick them out and watch their progress. Like most programs at your local short track, the show consisted of practice, qualifying, a trophy dash, heat races, and finally the main event. I was so disappointed that the driver I came to watch was out that I didn't pay much attention to the show. It's not that the cars weren't fast, they were, or the drivers weren't good, they were great. I just didn't know anything about them. Tony Izzo was the only name I knew. I was glad I got to see a late model dirt car race, but I didn't know enough about it to really enjoy myself. I thought about leaving, but that's not something I would do. It's sort of insulting, a little like leaving a bar when the band starts playing. Just something I wouldn't do. After all the heat races, I waited to see how they determined who was going to be in the main event. Then I heard a murmur from the crowd. They were looking toward the pits. I joined them, and lo and behold, there was pink number 66 on a flatbed truck returning to the pits. I knew there was no way the car could have possibly been repaired. The damage was too extensive. I worked my way toward the seating near the pit entrance and was able to pick up what was going on from the drivers and pit personnel coming and going through the pit gate. It seems the Izzo shop is less than a mile from Santa Fe Speedway, and they had a spare car there. Now I was impressed. Most racers are lucky to have one frontline race car. You have to remember, while they call late model dirt cars stock cars, They aren't. They are full-blown race cars, and nothing on them comes from a production car. They use custom-made tube frames, aluminum engines with titanium rods and valves. In other words, expensive. The fact that this Tony Izzo had 2 of them was something of a shock. Apparently, they took the damaged car back to the shop and transferred the Santa Fe setup to the spare and returned. The track agreed to let the track champion start the main event from the back of the pack. I also learned what happened to his first car earlier in the evening. The grease plug fell out of the rear end, and he lost the rear end grease. In a few laps, the rear end locked up, and at full throttle on the straight, more than enough force was available to spin the entire rear end, breaking everything that was connected to it and spinning it out from under the car and into the air. Now I was interested. The person I came to see was back and circulating behind the field. When the green flag dropped, starting the race, the field of perhaps 20 cars burst into violent action. Of course, my eyes went to the back of the field to watch the pink number 66. He didn't seem to be moving forward, so my attention went back to the leaders, as 2 or 3 of them were separating from the pack, and it appeared they were about to pass the pink number 66 car. After a few laps, the lead cars stopped being a threat to the pink number 66. In fact, the field was catching them, and the pink number 66 car was starting to pass the car in front of him. As I watched, I was thinking that the replacement pink number 66 car must not be as good as the first car he came with, because he wasn't exactly mowing them down as I expected. The cars that originally jetted into the lead had now dropped back in the pack that was chasing them. I tried to pay attention to them because I didn't know the sport, but I did know there were a couple of former track champions in the group, and I wanted to watch them work. Before I could figure out who was who, my attention was back on the pink number 66 car, as somehow he had quietly passed several cars. Tony Izzo had a reputation of being a tough guy, and I expected he would be roughing up some of the guys as he was passing. But I didn't see any of that. In fact, what I saw was a smooth drive, low on the track. At the halfway point of the race, it was obvious that the groove, let me explain. The groove is the fastest way around the track, and as a race progresses, you can actually see a path developing, sort of being worked into the surface of the track by all of the cars sliding or by the rear wheel spinning, glossing the surface. This creates what the drivers call a groove. Anyway, the groove had worked its way up the track, and most of the fast guys were working the high side, except the pink number 66. Izzo was almost workmanlike, running on the inside of the track. The good news was nobody else was running on the inside, so there was room. The bad news was the fast way around was high on the track. The cars were spectacular up there. The brute power they had was carrying them all through the corners sideways. It was cool, but as I kept checking on the progress of the pink number 66 car, it was obvious he was picking off a car a lap, and at this rate, it was starting to look like he actually had a chance to win. It wasn't what I expected. I thought the pink 66 car would be blasting by the field, running over everything in its path. That wasn't what I was seeing. I mentioned it to one of the other spectators, who just said it was typical Izzo. He's a bottom feeder, obviously referring to the pink number 66 car working through the field on the inside, while the other top drivers were high, wide, and handsome, blasting around the outside. Another spectator, hearing the comments, yelled, "He has to run where they're not." Well, he was right. The pink number 66 car was fast, but deceptively fast, using a smooth, polished, less than spectacular inside line. By the 3/4 mark of the race, it was starting to look like the pink number 66 car had a chance to win. But, thinking to myself, passing the lead cars that were still in front of him won't be as easy as the rest of the field. To my amazement, the pink number 66 car won. I couldn't believe it. After starting dead last on a tight track that didn't look like it was even possible to pass, he passed the entire field and won. I was more than a little impressed and thought to myself, this guy must know something the others don't. Many years later, I would learn that was exactly the case. When I started producing Motorsports Unlimited, I got to know Tony Izzo through Lee Byers at Dependable Carburetor. Lee was a former dirt car racer who became a very successful businessman and, as the owner of Dependable Carburetor, sponsored many top late model dirt cars. If you've been watching Motorsports Unlimited for any length of time, you know we eventually featured Tony Izzo on a number of episodes of Motorsports Unlimited. This was arranged by Lee Byers. I was always surprised at how willingly he shared information about how he set his cars up for Santa Fe Speedway. What I saw that night was no fluke. Tony was a believer in setting the car up so it came to him as the race progressed. He always said the idea wasn't to be the fastest car for the first few laps or a single lap. The idea was to lead the last lap. By the time he finished his career and Santa Fe Speedway closed, He was the unparalleled, unprecedented 9-time Santa Fe Speedway track champion, so he certainly knew what he was talking about. I always felt that the more people knew about racing, the more they could enjoy it. For example, the late model dirt cars all use the same engines, the small block Chevys, or at least that's what they called them. The fact is there wasn't a single part from General Motors or Chevrolet in the engines. They were custom built aluminum engines that looked like small block Chevys. They all had the same cylinder bore size, but were available as 400 cubic inches, 410 cubic inches, 420 cubic inches, 430 cubic inches, and even some experimental 440 cubic inch motors. The difference was always the stroke. The 400 cubic inch engine had the shorter stroke, and Tony revealed years later he always favored the 400 cubic inch size at Santa Fe. The fact was Santa Fe was a small track, and all the engines had more horsepower than they could get to the ground at Santa Fe. But the shorter stroke of the 400 meant less reciprocating mass, and when you lifted the throttle, the RPM came down immediately. This meant improved engine braking. The effect on the track was the engine helped slow the car instead of depending completely on the brakes. He'd learned over the years that using the brakes heavily resulted in brake fade, so by using some engine braking and less brakes, the brakes lasted longer. Thus, 20 laps in, when the other guy's brakes were failing, his were still strong. This was just one example of setting the car up to come to him as the race progressed. I was actually surprised at how much Tony was willing to reveal on television. Like me, he understood the more people knew about what was going on, the more they could enjoy the races. It's a little like football. If you don't know the rules, or any of the players, or any of the teams, it just looks like guys running into each other and falling down. Enjoyment comes from understanding, and I found that in addition to being a fine driver, Tony was smart. He was the first to bring aluminum rods to Santa Fe and later titanium rods. He understood the physics involved, but even more important, he understood the need for spectators and was more than willing to help people understand. Actually, the football example I used was apt because I remember what television did for pro football. When videotape was invented, it was possible to take this complicated game apart and teach it to the audience piece by piece. Its popularity exploded. When people realized what there was to watch, interest skyrocketed. I'm often amused these days when somebody talks about the skilled positions in football. I usually ask, what position in pro football isn't skilled? Once one understands it and knows what to watch for, every position is skilled. So, why did I tell this story about the first time I saw a late model dirt kart race? Because I remember thinking that night, what a shame it is that more people don't know about this kind of racing, and they would know about this if television treated motorsport the same way they treated football, baseball, basketball, and hockey. If television brought the stories of motorsport to the public the same as they did for our competitors for public attention, there would have been 50 or 60 or even 70,000 people there to enjoy it. If television, every channel, every day, several times a day, detailed the activities and exploits of the participants in motorsport, these people's names would be household words like Jordan and Butkus and Peyton and Banks and all the rest. Television has unparalleled power to influence, as my experience watching the exploits of Wayne Gretzky showed. An activity I cared nothing about captured my attention through the seemingly never-ending television coverage of the goal scoring of Wayne Gretzky. If television covered motorsport like they cover what we are now forced to call traditionally covered sports, Tony Izzo would have been a household name, as well as many others. Remember, I said at the beginning of this little story, I was telling you about something I experienced at Santa Fe Speedway, but similar stories were a part of every local track, from Raceway Park to Waukegan Speedway to Lake Geneva Raceway and all the rest. Motorsport has plenty of stories and plenty of stars and plenty of characters. You just don't know about them because television has chosen to exclude motorsport and advance the commercial interests of those we compete with for public attention at our expense. Let me interrupt for a moment to update an earlier show. If you'll recall, during Rock 3 2015, I was reading newspaper coverage of America's first auto race. In that coverage was a reference to something I didn't understand. It seems one of the competitors in the race got his front wheel caught in a frog. A frog! I had no idea what it was and couldn't find anything on the internet. When the program aired in Skokie, one of our viewers emailed an answer. His name is Dick Friedman, and he wrote, "A frog refers to the intersection of two sets of tracks, such as tracks of a siding merging with the main line tracks. From above, it looks like the legs of a frog. In 1895, there were frogs all over Chicago for trolley cars, interurbans, and steam and electric railroads. Thanks for the clarification, Dick. Oh, I should tell you that Dick is a car guy and sent pictures of a beautiful restoration he did on his 1956 Plymouth featuring a polyspherical V8 engine. One of these days we'll have to get it on Motorsports Unlimited. Thanks for taking the time to write, Dick. All right, we'll have to leave it there for this week. I should probably explain, these pieces you've seen on this program were produced weeks and sometimes months apart, depending on how I feel. Please remember, this is a public access cable show, and that means, among other things, we work with very few resources. We certainly don't have writers to write this material. It's all me. Of course, for those who have been watching a very long time, when Chris Schutz was still alive, it was Chris and me. It was wonderful. She was an excellent secretary who knew shorthand, so I was able to dictate thoughts to her, and she would create beautifully typed material from what I dictated. Unfortunately, I don't type, but when she passed away, all the typing fell on my shoulders. It takes me hours to do the things she used to do in minutes. Add to that, my back problems limit my typing time to an hour or so at a sitting. The point of telling you all this is so you'll understand why these simple appearing programs take so long to produce and why I produce them one piece at a time. For example, the piece you just saw took 4 days just to write. I'm a one-finger typist. The middle finger on my right hand is all I use. Arthritis has pretty much rendered the other fingers useless for typing purposes. You'd think I'd use my index finger, but no, it's the middle finger of my right hand. Anyway, it takes time, but I soldier on. The message is important, and I'm sure by now I've opened more questions than I've answered. It's unavoidable. I've lived a long time and had a lot of experiences that formed my views. And if you were to understand why I started Motorsports Unlimited, I have to walk you through a little of what I've experienced. I haven't forgotten. The purpose of this exercise is to remind you about the creation of Motorsports Unlimited, and I'll get there. I have no choice. John Platania, the man who comes to the studio to help me produce this material, keeps saying, "Bill, what is this? More talking?" John wants gearhead stuff. But I keep telling him, bear with me, this is important. You see, first one has to understand at least a little of the background before one will understand why Motorsports Unlimited was created. I needed to remind myself sometimes that when Motorsports Unlimited started, there was no motorsport on television. There was no cable. NASCAR wasn't on the air. The most we got was tape-delayed coverage of the Indy 500. I'm wondering how many of you remember ABC's Wide World of Sports once a week, where they switched suddenly from cliff diving to a tape of a part of a race somewhere in the world to bullfighting in Spain. Anyway, part of our work would be hard to understand if you didn't live during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and I'll try to explain the pertinent parts as briefly as possible. In any event, try to remember what I've said until next time when I'll continue. This is Bill Wildt saying thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
This program made possible in part by support from ABC Auto Parts, located on Ashland Avenue at 138th Street in Blue Island, Illinois.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Jimmy's Red Hots, located on Grant Avenue and Pulaski Road in Chicago.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.